Hello my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, where we're going to be continuing our look at the Black Shuck Shadows series from Black Shuck Books, a very, very reputable publisher, who I believe operates out of the UK, actually. As I mentioned in the last review, which was for Dan Coxon's Green Fingers, very, very, very fine collection. They are very representative of the kinds of, the range of fiction that you're able to find on independent and small press markets at the moment, and just ironically, given the title and the subject of this video, the various voices that are out there. If you go and look at the Black Shuck Shadows series, you are guaranteed to find something that resonates, because each of the collections, it's not only formulated around a particular theme or a particular concept that coheres all of the short stories inside. They are representative of that writer's works. It's almost like getting a little portfolio or a manifesto of what these writers are about, and that's really, really cool. If you're looking for, if you're actually like me, if you're kind of moving away from mainstream fiction, if you're finding it a little bit too tame, a little bit too boring, a little bit by the numbers at this point, the Black Shuck Shadows series is well worth your time, because you will find something here. You'll find something interesting. Now, as is the case with a lot of these collections, this one is book 17. I am reading them all out of order because there's no particular imperative to read them in any kind of order. They're generally unrelated from one another. This is book 17, written by my colleague Kit Power. This is Voices, and it's an interesting exercise because I have obviously, many of you will recognize Kit from our work on the What the Hell Is Wrong With This podcast, which you can also find knocking about this channel. So I have extra context when it comes to reviewing this book. It's an odd feeling. It's a very strange thing because it layers in different levels and lenses of interpretation. I can often hear Kit's voice, interestingly, in these stories. I can actually sort of feel his politics and his ideologies sort of coming through, and that's a really, really interesting thing. It's almost a new thing. I mean, you can become familiar with writers and with creators, but very often there is that distance between them. You very rarely get to interact with them at any kind of intimate level. But Kit and I have spoken for as you know, hours and hours and hours on end on all sorts of subjects. So it's very, very interesting. I mean, what Voices provides, as I said before, is almost like a manifesto. This is what Kit's fiction is about, sort of condensed down, so that you can get a taste and a flavour for it. Now, just as Dan Coxon's book, Green Fingers, was cohered by a particular theme and a particular concept, which was it was almost like a botanical concept. It was greenery, it was plant life, it was nature. It was very sort of a subjective theme. It was about the subject matter of the stories. This one is slightly different because it's not cohered by subject matter. Rather, it's cohered by a particular form. As the title suggests, Voices, the whole point of the collection is that each story represents a different kind of narrative voice. Now, they're all in the first person, but Kit plays with that. He actually plays around with that quite a lot. Like, for example, one of the things he does, which is actually all the way through this book, it's not just about presenting like different styles of voice. It's not just about presenting different tones and accents or anything like that, although Kit does do that. It's more about presenting it's exploring how you can actually present very different kinds of story and very different kinds of voice with a coherent and familiar form. So although they're all first person, all the voices are extraordinarily different, and the stories are generally very interesting because the narrators are unreliable. They're almost universally unreliable for one reason or another. Some of them have something wrong with them, for example. Some of them are revealed to have some kind of mental health problem. Some of them are addicts. Some of them are distorted by superstition or by bias or by ideology. There's one very interesting story in here, actually, which I've read before. I believe it's part sarcastically entitled All-Loving, All-Knowing, which gives you a clue as to Kit's perspectives on religion, prescribed ideology, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing about this short story is the way it plays with the concept of first-person narrative. So it is a first-person narrative, but it's not from the perspective of the story's protagonist. It's really weird in that regard. It actually draws back and presents for you a God's eye view. This is a story from the perspective of an omniscient creator God who is looking down upon the protagonist with all of the knowledge and information of who this protagonist is, who they've been, what they could be, what they're going to do, and why. It's really fascinating. As an exercise, there are so many layers and levels going on here. First of all, it demonstrates just how sarcastic the title is, all-knowing and all-loving, because this creator is not. This creator is a bastard. He's removed from what he is perceiving and what he has created. And he's looking at this character in terms of influence. So he's dissecting why this character is the way he is, why certain decisions and thoughts and emotions occur to him, and why the influences, the unspoken, unseen influences upon this character's life are leading to an explosion, to an atrocity. And it's more a commentary on the narrator than it is the character. It's very clever in that regard. This is something you find all the way through. One of my personal favourites in the collection, Like a Charm, that is written from the perspective of a police officer, and it demonstrates how not only how superstition can distort perspective, because the narrating voice in this story is both reliable and unreliable. It's reliable in the sense that he's telling the truth. He's not trying to lie to the reader, in the same way that some of the narrating voices in this book are, by the way. That's another thing. I love that, by the way. Just as a tangent, I love that. Not only do I like the notion of unreliable narrators, I actually like being played about as a reader or as a consumer, as an audience. I love that. When films, when video games, when stories lie to me and they reveal themselves to be something else, or that something else is going on, I love that. And you'd be surprised how rare that is in first-person narration. Very often, they're quite honest with the reader. They may not be honest with other people, but they're generally quite honest with the reader. Now, this narrator simultaneously is and isn't. He's honest in the sense that generally what he's conveying, he feels to be true. He feels it to be true. He's dishonest in the sense that he's delusional, or he may be delusional. It's one of those wonderful things where, because you're getting a particular perspective, what you're getting is bias and distortion, and Kit is so aware of that. He's so aware of that. So this character, this police officer, happens to come across a bullet which has his name on it. It's like it's the metaphor made literally true, and he regards it as a kind of good luck charm, and it charts his career and his life throughout his tenure as a police officer. And throughout that tenure, he seems to avoid situations that would be absolutely lethal to anyone else. And I mean absolutely lethal to anyone else. He seems to perceive almost supernatural things happening around him. So things like he should have died multiple times, but things like the guns misfire, the bullets explode in the barrel, that kind of thing. And he seems to believe that because he has this bullet, that's why it's happening. But at the same time, as a result of that, his life is collapsing around him, his personal life is dying, people won't work with him because they seem to have some sort of superstition about him. The people who work with him tend to die. But again, it's unreliable. It's very difficult to say whether that's because of his distorted perspectives. We know that this guy has problems. We know from the beginning that there is some kind of perceptual distortion going on, and then that is enhanced because I believe at some point he actually does become he becomes the cliche. He becomes the the cop who can't take it, who ends up being a little bit drunk, a little bit of an addict. And he's aware of that. I mean, he's very aware of that. And he is real enough to be aware of that cliche and that he's fulfilling it. It's a really interesting thing. It's something, it's emblematic of something I really like about these stories, and that is they are intimate. You can actually feel this kind of colloquialism coming through. Actually, I know for a fact that Kit is heavily influenced by the likes of Stephen King, the American horror writers of the 1980s, who kind of took the more stilted and stuffy British and European horror fiction, which was always a little bit more formal and a little bit more removed, and made it more personable, made it more colloquial, like you're having a chat with someone, like the writing is talking to you as the reader. And that's what you get from these stories. There is a colloquial quality to the writing. It's like you're sitting down having a chat with these people. That's very Stephen King. Stephen King does that. And I can see that influence in these stories, and it's really cool. It's really, really cool. One of the first stories in the collection, Baptism, it does a similar thing where you are presented with a particular scenario, and it seems as though you're unsure as to whether something supernatural is happening or whether it is a matter of incipient madness, it's hallucination, it's distorted perceptions. There is actually, I mean, there's some, before you dive into this book, just a warning, there is some horrible imagery in here and some really nasty triggering concepts as well. And I mean genuinely triggering. I mean, like, Kit touches on subjects like school shootings, there's murder, there's maiming, there's some really, really horrible stuff in this book. But Kit uses that to explore something interesting. In Baptism, one of the things that really gets me, there is a moment where the narrator, the protagonist, experiences something truly hallucinatory, truly transcendental, and it's beautiful. It's really amazing. It's horrific, it's hellish, but it's absolutely beautiful. And that's the point at which you as the reader start to realize that maybe this guy isn't quite on the level. Maybe he isn't quite as it's not that he's insincere. This narrator is very sincere, but he may have something wrong with him. He may be operating from religious delusion or something to that effect. Another favorite in the collection, Pulling Teeth. Now this one is really sad. It's a really sad story. I interpret this as being about madness myself. It's hard to say once again whether what the narrator is relaying is literally true, or whether what's happened is because of trauma, they've started to associate a particular life experience with something terrible happening. So it's almost like a commentary upon the way our minds develop or cultivate superstition. And the story very cleverly leaves it up to you. You don't know whether the narrator is on the level or whether it's not that they're lying, they're definitely not lying, or whether it is simply that this delusion has been cultivated and developed and developed and developed, been reinforced by people around them and by successive trauma up to the point whereby they become paranoid and delusional. It's hard to say. They are a massively unreliable narrator. I like that. I really like that. I mean, one of the things I find interesting more than anything about this collection is something I actually really like about this collection is that, like a lot of the very best work that's marketed under the horror label or within the horror genre, and certainly within the Black Shuck Shadows series, it takes the parameters and expectations of what you might have with regards to horror fiction and just blows them wide. It dares to say that actually horror fiction is not this, or this. It doesn't have to be this, or this. It can actually explore real things. It can actually be serious. It can be emotional. It can be traumatic. It can actually be used to explore ideas. It can be deeper and denser than that. A lot of the stories in this collection are about life experiences. You know, they're about death, they're about birth, they're about love and its loss, they're about lots of different things. The last story in the collection, The Garden, is very well placed and is emblematic of that because it is about the experience of death and grief and how we process that, you know, how the world allows us to process that. It's very beautiful, very, very beautiful indeed. Like a lot of the Black Shuck Shadows books, because it's such a small collection, you know, it's only, what, 118 pages. It's nothing, you know, you can read this in a night. And that is actually really good for the stories, because it forces a degree of elegance, which it actually fits very well with the first person narration. It fits very, very well indeed. The stories are by nature and just necessarily very pithy, very colloquial, very conversational, you know? You can just breeze through them, despite the fact that they actually have a great deal of weight to them. It's a very, 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 very enjoyable book indeed, but also one that's actually quite deep and dense in terms of its ideas, which anyone who's read Kit's fiction will know that's kind of par for the course. That's what he does, you know? Kit's one of those writers who wants to talk to you. He actually wants to start a conversation. He doesn't just want to tell you a passive story, you know? He doesn't just want to entertain you. He actually wants to start a dialogue and to start rumination. He wants to ferment things in your head. And Voices is, as I've said before, it's kind of the manifesto for that. Well worth checking out. Well worth checking out. When we come back, my loves, we will be taking a look at Suffer Little Children by Penny Jones. So, until then, my dears, bye-bye!